our discussion of Keynes becomes one of the economists that, maybe outside of Adam Smith, would be an economist that many have finally heard of. And Keynes becomes known as an economist um, not until 10 years before his death, 1936, when he publishes the famous work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Now, he had written a great deal before that. He was involved at very high levels in the English government. I think he was in the Foreign Affairs Office and whatnot. But um, you know, how we know of him in the United States is really from his 1936 work. And what he does, I mean, at least from my perspective, he becomes one of the um, first economists that's truly a macroeconomist. Um, and he does that by building up this aggregate income expenditure model. Or, when you've taken principles and whatnot, would be what we would call the aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis. And when he comes out with this work in 1936, I mean, what becomes useful for that discussion is that it's happening exactly at the time as the Great Depression. And the issue with the Great Depression did not start with the stock market crash in 1929. I'll repeat that again. It did not start with the stock market crash in 1929. It's very popular and very easy to connect the two together, in a cause-effect relationship. Cause, stock market crash, effect, Great Depression starts. Not that simple. Really, the worst parts of the Great Depression really don't emerge until 1933, as the Hoover administration is ending and FDR takes office. So it's just, and there's been a lot of really interesting work talking about the cause of the Great Depression. You know, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, a great deal of the cause of the Great Depression was that things, after that shock, let's say, of the stock market crash, things got worse because things kept happening that were counter to what we would understand what you would want to do today. And additionally, that the actors that you would expect to act a great deal in times of economic crisis, such as the federal government and the Federal Reserve, were not acting at that time. So, you would want the federal government, to spend money to stimulate the economy with expansionary fiscal policy during an economic contraction. And instead, the Hoover administration reduced the amount of money that was being spent. You would want the Federal Reserve to increase the money supply as a form of expansionary monetary policy. They did exactly the opposite. They engaged in contractionary monetary policy, if any policy at all. Because at this time, the Federal Reserve wasn't really that influential or powerful. And the government really saw its role not as stimulating the economy, but rather saw its role as one of just making sure, we meet the needs of like national defense and some very broad, very general um, uh, public service options. So it's with Keynes that you get this discussion of the necessity of a central bank to stimulate. It's with Keynes that you get this necessity of a federal government that stimulates the economy. And it's with Keynes that we really get that in-depth discussion of the business cycle. Because even at this point, before Keynes, we were kind of just fumbling around with what the cause of business cycles were. At this time, you get organizations like the National Bureau of Economic Research and whatnot that are kind of just coming onto the stage of how to do that work. But Keynes can explain the business cycle using his aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis. Before Keynes, we really only had neoclassical microeconomics that came back from the age of Marshall, basically. So, refer back to your Marshall lecture. Keynes is the one that pushes economics back into the direction of macroeconomics. And what he does on the theoretical level, from the neoclassicals, he's rejecting Say's law. So let's just refer back to what Say's law said. Say's law says that the economy self-adjusts. So if the economy self-adjusts, why are we wasting, right? The argument would be, why are we wasting our time looking at business cycles, or even what causes the Great Depression? Because the economy will just adjust out of it. You're not going to get any long-term unemployment. Any unemployment is going to be short-term. Any deviation from the equilibrium is going to be temporary. And what Keynes does, as we'll see here in this lecture, what Keynes does is he says that not all prices are flexible. And so because not all prices are flexible, and there's some stickiness, some inflexibility, that stickiness and inflexibility causes these deviations. And the stickiness prevents the economy from going back to an equilibrium. Why do we see this stickiness? Well, the stickiness could come from the fact that in the short run, there are these imperfections in the market caused by unions, caused by imperfect competition, caused by contracts that are signed, labor contracts, business contracts for selling a good. And so it's only in the long run that you get that flexibility. And so it's only in the long run that you would expect to be back in equilibrium. In the short run, we wouldn't have to be. And because we wouldn't have to be, that's how we can understand business cycles existing. Okay, so with that overview of Keynes, let's start getting into the lecture here. So he's born June 5th, same day, month and day as me, 1883, same year as Marx. Now remember, Adam Smith is also born June 5th. So you got three economists you now know, at least one personally, me, that are all born on June 5th. His father was a noted economist, John Neville Keynes. He went to a pretty famous school in England, Eton. But most notably, he had studied economics at Cambridge under Marshall. Right, so he had one of the greatest neoclassical economists as his professor. So he was obviously well trained in the leading microeconomic neoclassical theory at the time. And so then from Eton, he graduated from Cambridge, and from Cambridge, he entered the civil service. So India at the time was a colony of Britain, and so he worked for 2 years at the British East India Office, and then he came back to Cambridge, worked on his dissertation, and then because he did so well on his civil service exam, right? So he went into civil service government work. He was placed back in the East India Office. Now, Keynes made a lot of money. He made a lot of money because he understood financial markets very well. In fact, there's actually if you're interested in this kind of thing there's this kind of really funny joke that economists sometimes make of like, economists looking really poor. Like, for instance, I drive a really shitty car and whatnot. And there's this joke where someone said to Keynes, like, you know, you think you're so smart about like global markets and macroeconomics. If you're so smart, why aren't you rich? To which Keynes replied, you know, why do you think that I'm not? Because he was. So he was actually the bursar, meaning he handled all the money at King's College, and he helped that college increase its endowment very well. Just out of curiosity here, I'm going to pause this because I'm going to look for an article here that's really interesting. One second. Yeah, so here's the article. If you're interested in reading it, you can either download it yourself or I can download it for you, and I can send it to you. But it's actually a really interesting article talking about Keynes as an investment innovator, and what his portfolio looked like, and how he was as an investor at King's College. You know, and when we talk about someone like myself, someone who does history of economic thought, and you think, geez, why do you even use that kind of stuff? Here would be one of the rare instances where there's some modern day applicability to being a historian of economic thought. It's a really interesting article. It's not very long, 15 pages, very easy to read. So if you're interested in this, you can either look this up yourself or send me a quick email and I'll happily send it to you. Okay, let's go back to the slides. Keynes was part of the Bloomsbury Group, um, and he married what many say is was someone very beautiful, Lydia Lopakova, in 1926. He was in a pretty I don't know how you describe this. Um, um, I guess the last bullet point really does highlight him as a person. He had a lot of talents. He was very confident in his abilities. Um, you know, he was kind of alpha male-ish. I don't know really how else to describe him. He was a patron of the arts, so he did love the arts largely because I think of his wife. Um, but what you can see here is that the book that he's most known for, the 1936 text, General Theory of Employment, Money and Interest, you know, which initiates the Keynesian revolution, which is what gets us the aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis. That was just his fourth well-known book. Before that, he was actually quite famous for the Economic Consequences of the Peace, his 1921 text, which correctly said, because of the reparations that were imposed on Germany after World War One, that was a really bad thing to do because you were going to really piss Germany off and it might cause something worse. Dude, he was right. I mean, in some sense, it caused World War II, because that austerity, those cutbacks gave, to some extent, that opening for, you know, kind of Hitler to take office, for them to rearm themselves. So Economic Consequences of the Peace turned out to be a quite true text. Treatise on Money, 1930. This is the prelude to general theory. And then he wrote largely a statistics textbook. He was obviously pretty good at math at a time when most economists didn't use a great deal of math. Unlike others, he was very much in favor of the existing economic system. He went to Cambridge. He went to Eton. He was a member of the establishment. He believed in capitalism. He wasn't trying to overthrow the system. Really, what he did is he just saw the problem in the current understanding of capitalism, which was that we didn't understand the severity of the business cycle. And that because we didn't understand the severity of the business cycle, then what that does is it creates all this social misery. And then capitalism itself comes under siege because of the depths, the worst parts of the business cycle. Now, let's look at this. It's kind of a part of this here. So the National Bureau of Economic Research is in the United States the organization. It's not part of the government, but it is the organization that is officially charged with deciding when we've reached a recession and whatnot. I'm gonna scroll. So they looked at data all the way back to pre-Civil War. Let's remember 1936 is when general theory comes out. Look at this. The length of the business cycle is significantly elongated. 50% larger. Sorry, double actually, double what it was between 1854 and 1919 in the post-World War II era, 1945 to 2020, a time when we're practicing Keynesian economics. The average length of a business cycle was 5 years, whereas it used to be a little over 2 years. That's a significant improvement in the economy. And you can see, even looking at the shorter time period, the interwar period between 1919 and 1945, we didn't make a lot of progress, even when the Federal Reserve is existing at this point. You really get I mean, we don't have any affirmative proof, but that's pretty strong evidence to suggest that Keynesian macroeconomics did lead to a better understanding of the business cycle. So as I said, general theory of employment, money, and interest, where he outlines what aggregate demand looks like. This would be the time where you bring into question Say's law, where you start to bring about this idea that the economy will not always be in equilibrium. And so if it can't always be in equilibrium, then the question would be one of, well, then how do you get it back into equilibrium? How do you get it back to where the long run aggregate supply function exists? What we would say, right, is that it's possible for the economy to not be at full employment. And if it's not at full employment, then what emerges are short-run equilibriums that might not be the long-run equilibrium. And so to remind us of what that looks like here, let me bring out the pen here and do a little drawing here for us. Hopefully you remember from either macro or intermediate macro. Now this looks like a demand curve, but it's called aggregate demand. This Q is our measurement of real GDP. And then our price level, we could measure that with things like the GDP deflator. Okay? And then we have our long run aggregate supply, which is let's call it Q star, which is basically our long run equilibrium. It's determined by the PPF. Right, so this is just our long run possible capabilities. And so it is possible that the short run aggregate supply function could be here. But it's also possible. Summary. It's also possible that it could be here. And now look at what happens. Now you've got a short run equilibrium that's here, which is less than the long run equilibrium. So if you're producing less than the long run, that would mean you have some higher unemployment. It would also be possible that the short run aggregate supply function could be here instead. So let's just call this 1 and let's call this 2. Now it would be possible in the short run to have a Q that's to the right of the long run position, meaning that you're producing more than you otherwise would be able to produce, meaning that the unemployment would be lower than usual. So look at that, we've got three scenarios here. One where you're in long run equilibrium, a short run aggregate supply function that's here, and one that's here. Where it is determines whether we are in a short run equilibrium or not. And it also determines whether we're at a point where we're in a recessionary gap, as we are right here. If we're in an inflationary gap, which would be right here, or if we're in long run equilibrium. All of these possible equilibriums is what this last case is identifying here. Meaning, we can now do things to change the position of the economy. Okay? Now, what is the thing that we can change? What we can do is we can change the position of the aggregate demand function. So now that goes to our first bullet point here. For Keynes, aggregate demand could be deficient. Which would mean, let's change the color of our pen here. Which would mean I could go from this point to this point, get us out of that recession that's right here, and move us to equilibrium by shifting the aggregate demand question. The question would be, which Keynes will have to answer here, is how do you actually shift aggregate demand? Now, in general theory, which I actually have read, some of these economists that we're talking about here, I've never read, all of the original of Smith or something like that. But in this case here, I have read general theory of the basically general theory. I have read that, and what we can see again is that his understanding of these deficiencies are basically caused by inadequate aggregate demand. And he acknowledges Malthus, he credits Malthus with this understanding of what causes these downturns. So Malthus being one of the first to do this. But he basically says that Malthus didn't go far enough. He didn't develop the theory far enough. And that because Malthus didn't, Ricardo's analysis became dominant, and Ricardo was one who believed in Say's law. So building off of Malthus, Keynes focuses on aggregate demand and how to better understand how to stimulate aggregate demand to get the outcome that you want. Now, what's going to cause this deficiency in aggregate demand? One of the things could be the volatility of investment. So if you remember here, the GDP equals CIG and NX. And just in case you are curious how much of an economist is Scheiding, my license plate is for the state of Hawaii. It says this, because right, that would be total income, which is Y, or GDP, Y, CIGNX. I've had this license plate for about 6 months, and only one person has ever acknowledged my license plate and how cool it is. But it is. I actually give credit though also to James Murray over at the University of Wisconsin. He was my roommate in graduate school, and he's got the same license plate over in Wisconsin. So, and I thought it was so cool that I got permission from him to copy him and we've got dueling license plates. I do not have it. I don't have any tattoos or anything cool like that. So about the only cool thing I can do to show that I'm an economist would be this cool license plate. Anyway, that I in this equation is investment. And what Keynes believed is that that investment component of the GDP is the most volatile. And that comes from the fact of capitalists being who they are and not engaging in saving, which for them is called investment, for them not in saving in a consistent way. And what we see is that one of those components of investment is inventory. And inventory comes down to this idea that businesses at times build more than they're actually selling, which can stimulate the economy in those kinds of ways. In terms of household savings and whatnot, yes, households save, and that is a part of this. But capitalists, for him, the businesses, are really the big parts of this. So if investment is not sufficient, if capitalists are not investing enough, then one of these other components for Keynes, one of these other components is going to have to make up the difference. Either C, G, or NX. Or you have to do something that could cause I to not change as much. Okay, so that's the Keynesian part of this. So Keynes, to create his theory of aggregate demand, right, to kind of explain that graph that we had there, to explain that theory of aggregate demand, what he has are three theories: theory of consumption, investment demand, and the theory of interest, a liquidity preference. In the theory of consumption, what he refers to as the fundamental psychological law is that what he says is that basically people spend a portion of their income. Now we see this in when you do even principles of macro, but you see this when we talk about this idea that consumption equals some fixed amount plus something that changes as a fraction of your income being Y. What we call this is your marginal propensity to consume. That's kind of what this is right here. So that all comes from page 96 of the general theory, is that if people have more income, if Y goes up, then consumption will go up. Not as much. I made the arrow a little bit shorter, right? Because it's only going to go up by about 80% of what the income is. But it will go up. And that's what you see right here. You can see that consumption starts at a non-zero point, right? So that's what we call the autonomous consumption, right? We need some income to survive. And then the slope is that marginal propensity to consume. And that thing that I just made up on the previous slide, that would be 0.8. That consumption goes up by 0.8 when income goes up by 1. And that's just right here. I'm not going to read all this. I just kind of explained this here. Now, following from the marginal propensity to consume, which is kind of like common sense, is this idea of the multiplier, which came from one of his students, Kahn. So he was actually, R.F. Kahn is an economist. I've got a book here. Let me look for my book here. One second. So Kahn was, I was just looking at I had some um, texts of Kahn. So Kahn came out with a text in, I think 1931, right after Keynes had written that kind of precursor to general theory. Kahn came out with a text that kind of started to outline this multiplier effect. The idea is, as the third bullet point highlights here, is that when consumers then spend more money because they have some additional income, that spending of the money stimulates the economy further. And so as it stimulates the economy further, right, it continues to get 0.8, 0.8, 0.8 of every additional amount of money being spent. So if we use this example, the marginal propensity to consume being 0.8, then 1 over 1 minus 0.8 would be 1 over 0.2, which would be 5. Meaning that for every amount that the income increases by 1, then the total GDP would increase by 5. So Kahn was one of 5 people he was one of 5. Keynes was the leader, but it was called the Cambridge Circus. And the Cambridge Circus was basically, Keynes had basically like a book group or a working group where he just basically talked every week to economists, mostly economists, about what his ideas were, and they worked through things, and that helped Keynes write the general theory. Kahn was really important because actually he replaced Keynes as the bursar at King's College. Kahn, in some opinions, myself included, in some ways he was even a better economist and mathematician than Keynes in many ways. Yet Kahn is largely forgotten today. The second theory then would be investment demand. And that basically what we see here is that for investment demand is that if it's not sufficient, if there's not enough investment, then we see that there's changes in the expected return. And that basically if we have too much investment, then the returns will be much lower. The MEC will diminish as these additional capital investments are made. And that would be just what we see here. That as more and more investments are made, the returns on that capital, right? The capital is going to become less productive and the returns will fall. And that leads us to the third part of the theory of interest by Vaggi and Groenewegen, is that at least in the Treatise of Money, 1931, Keynes's text, we had more emphasis on savings and stimulating investment, but largely because of the Cambridge Circus and the work of economists like Kahn. By 1934, right, so this treatise had already been published, general theory had not been published yet. By 1934, Keynes shifted. And instead of looking at savings, he looked at consumption. And then instead of looking at then what affects the overall demand function, sometimes then it becomes less about investment and more about consumption. So what Keynes needed, he needed this theory of interest to be able to determine the level of investment. But he needed that theory of interest to be independent of the savings and investment level. So what he uses is something called the liquidity preference theory. And so this is what he had developed in the Treatise of Money, the 1931 text. And it was in that liquidity preference theory where he looks at the preferences of individuals to be holding cash, to have less liquidity. Why do people, so then the question becomes one of why would people want to hold cash? Well, there are the first reason is pretty uninteresting here. It would just be this idea that people need cash to pay for their purchases. But more would be is like when you see that things are starting to go bad, what you would have is this idea of a precautionary motive um, or a speculative motive. Is that people would hold more cash, for instance, when COVID started as a precautionary motive, or when they think the economy is about to take a downturn, maybe they'll store more cash. Or when things are doing very, very well or very, very bad, they may instead then decide to hold a lot more cash to take advantage of some, certain opportunities or whatnot as they emerge. And so his quantity theory of money focuses for the most part on this transaction demand. Now, Keynes had added to this the speculative demand for money, this idea that money would be replacing other assets as an investment, right? Because you'd be saying like in an economic downturn, cash is king, right? Something along those lines, because it allows you then to swoop in and buy things right away. The quantity theory of money, though, because it's emphasizing transactions demand, the money is then not an asset. It's just a medium of exchange. But this would be what you see in principles of macro and even intermediate macro. It's a very simple money demand function which shows these liquidity preferences due to speculative demand for money. Speculative demand meaning people demand more money if interest rates are lower, because basically there's not a lot of value to holding money when the interest rate is lower, so you might as well hold cash and be able to deploy it as you want to. But the money supply function is completely vertical because, right, it's determined by the central bank. So now look at this. So now here emerges, this is important, here's where emerges the role of the central bank. Because in this sense, the central bank, rather than just working on having a stable banking system, its other role then is to determine the interest rate, which is really not something we talk about very much before Keynes. So now if the Federal Reserve can adjust the interest rate by changing the money supply, it then gives rise to influencing other parts of the economy. Now, just at the same time as Keynes is coming on the scene, so are the monetarists, where the monetarists then make those discussions about what they think, where the monetarists then make that discussion about why they think changing the money supply can cause inflation. For Keynes, though, changing the money supply is important because what it does is it changes the interest rate. And by changing the interest rate, you change the amount of investment and also the amount of savings, which the opposite of that would be consumption. By changing the interest rate, you change consumption and investment, which in turn changes the aggregate demand function. And so there you go, right? So here we have what's called the monetary transmission mechanism, or in this case, the Keynesian transmission mechanism, which would be changing the money supply changes the interest rate, which in turn, by changing the interest rate, changes the amount of investment such that it increases. Changing the amount of investment then moves us up, and this would be our Keynesian cross. It increases the equilibrium on the aggregate expenditure Keynesian cross. And by changing the equilibrium on the Keynesian cross, it in turn shifts where the aggregate demand function is. And that's all just right here. If you've kind of forgotten what the Keynesian transmission mechanism is, you can obviously read this, but this would also be something where if you took me for principles of macro, you could look back at that lecture, or if it's a little bit still confusing, you can send me an email and I can send you that lecture separately. But again, the idea is changing the money supply, which is our first bullet point here, changes the interest rate. So if I increase the money supply, which would be an expansionary monetary policy, then it reduces the interest rate. And by reducing the interest rate, investment then goes up. And by investment going up, then the aggregate demand function goes up. Why does aggregate demand function go up? Because we change the aggregate expenditure model, or the Keynesian cost. So then what we need, based on this analysis and this understanding, is for Keynes, we now have a new role for the government. We now have a new role for a central bank. And that would be, for Keynes, that the government should stabilize the overall economy. That for Keynes, what the government should do and what the central bank should do should work to decrease the interest rates, and it should increase government expenditures, all in an attempt to increase the aggregate demand function when we're in a recession or in a recessionary gap. And the issue could be as well, sorry, and I should go up to this part here. This happened in 2008, and the 2008 part of the discussion would be is that you can only move the interest rate so low. So even after COVID, right, they lowered the interest rate to zero. But you can't push on a string here, right? The idea is you can't make it any lower than zero. And so you reach what's called this liquidity trap, where basically monetary policy can't stimulate anymore when you're at an interest rate of zero. So in the 2008-2009 crisis, we obviously did have a right, the Bush administration and then later the Obama administration did engage in expansionary fiscal policy, meaning government spending did increase. But when that even wasn't enough, what they had to do was what was called quantitative easing, which was targeting specific assets and lowering the interest rates in those markets as well, such as the mortgage market, most notably, and other kinds of other forms of corporate debt. But because there is this limit on monetary policy, because monetary policy can only do so much, what you need for Keynes is that expansionary policy, or sorry, that expansionary fiscal policy, which is what he saw as even more effective than monetary policy. What you need is G increasing. And what you need is the government to be involved in creating that multiplier effect, because government spending in turn will increase consumption through that multiplier effect. Towards the end of general theory, he starts to outline a social philosophy, which is what led many people to believe which many people led to believe was something that he only did because he was worried about being called a communist or a socialist. I mean, I think he was just an open thinker. But I mean, the biggest thing about chapter 24 in General Theory, is that really what he just says is, if you don't follow what I'm all writing here, if you don't follow that, then capitalism is basically going to fall short. And if you don't make these innovations that I'm suggesting, capitalism is going to fall short and people are going to look for alternatives. The idea is that capitalism on its own, doesn't have an effective means for providing for full employment or for equally distributing income. And that general theory can accomplish some of those things. And what we see is that we get this through this idea that the business cycle becomes less intense, and the inequalities become less because people aren't as worried about having to really like invest a lot when things are doing well, because they know that things will do really bad. Things will be really bad when when we hit the bottom part of the business cycle. So because there's a bit more that things are balanced a little bit more, this in turn could kind of save capitalism. And what he argues for here is, for in general, a pretty low interest rate environment, because what that does is it encourages investments in capital. And what the state or the government can do is it can try to manage that overall level investment, but then it can also engage in social investments that help us get to a case where there'd be full employment. But he's not calling for, in general, state socialism. And so because he's not calling for that, then what you see, right, is basically Keynes having a celebration of capitalism in general. You just have these other things. I mean, this is just, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but, he was a believer in individuals having these liberties and freedoms, people being motivated by self-interest, all the kinds of things that we see in capitalism. And, and that also that we see that you can solve a problem of unemployment. The government can solve a problem of unemployment, by finding people jobs or just creating jobs. But the problem is that can also create less efficiency and freedom in the government, right? And so you see that in totalitarian, authoritarian states where they might have lower unemployment, but the economy overall is organized pretty poorly. So it'd be sort of the critique, as he saw it, of the Soviet Union and the way that economy was produced. Again, kind of deflecting some of these suspicions that he was a communist or a socialist. And the final thing that we can kind of really say about Keynes is that he was an academic. He was really an academic's academic. Even though he made a lot of money and he was involved in the markets and whatnot, he was a true an academic. And he just believed that academics basically were smarter than those in authority, and that those in power should listen more to those in the academy to get better ideas for how to manage a society. Now, the influence of Keynes, this is the last slide here, but the influence of Keynes then becomes pretty strong for 20 or 30 years. It becomes the dominant theory. Now, it stands in contrast to the monetarists, which we'll look at here with the Chicago School in the next lecture. But many people, especially those Harvard, even to some extent MIT, were strong believers in the Keynesian model. And obviously, we would see Roosevelt really dabbling a great deal in Keynesian theories to kind of get the economy stimulated.